to Tryon Palace, and welcome to a city that has lived through more than 275 years of American history, through the English rule of the colonies, the Revolution, and the Civil War. New Bern, North Carolina was named for Bern, Switzerland. It was the New Bern, founded in 1710, situated on a point of land where the Trent River flows into the Neuse. As you stroll through New Bern's restored neighborhoods, you will see dozens of homes and buildings in a striking diversity of periods and styles, from Georgian to Federal to Victorian. Most of the houses have been lived in since they were built in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Eli Smallwood House, over on East Front Street, is an outstanding example of Federal architecture. And you might like to visit the Academy, one of North Carolina's oldest existing schoolhouses. The Academy was in continuous use for 166 years. As you walk through New Bern, notice the rich details all around you, the doorways and the porches. New Bern provides a charming setting for the special places you came to see. Tryon Palace on the banks of the Trent River, and nearby the Dixon, Stevenson, and the Stanley Houses. These three structures were built within 60 years of each other.
Let's look first at the Stanley House, completed around 1783. This Georgian-style house bears the imprint of Philadelphia architecture. Notice the woodwork outside and inside. Each room of the Stanley House is beautifully proportioned and furnished to represent its history. The house has been the home of a patriot and a statesman. Its owner, John Wright Stanley, was one of New Bern's leading citizens and played a very active part in the Revolutionary War. When the Continental Congress met in 1775 and the move to independence began, Stanley's ships helped keep North Carolina's ports open. He was also one of the patriots who helped supply George Washington's army. Years later, Washington himself would spend a night at the Stanley House and record in his diary that it was exceeding good lodgings. Both John Wright Stanley and his wife died of yellow fever just 6 years after the completion of their house. After that, Stanley's son, John Stanley, lived there with his wife Elizabeth while he served in the North Carolina House of Commons and later in the U.S. Congress. Afterward, the house had a checkered career. During the Civil War, the house served first as a headquarters for General Burnside, and then, in 1862, it became a Union hospital run by Catholic sisters. It became a home again in 1884 to a local businessman and former Confederate Major, James Bryan. The house was moved in 1932. In 1935, the Bryan estate sold the house for $6,000. It became the public library for 30 years. In 1966, the house was given to the Tryon Palace Commission and moved to its present location. Restored and furnished according to Mr. Stanley's inventory, it awaits your visit. Enthusiasm for the new American democracy popularized a new form of classical design known as the Federal style. Located near the entrance to the Tryon Palace is a fully restored example of the Federal or neoclassical style, the Dixon Stevenson House. It was built about 1830 by an early mayor of New Bern, George W. Dickson. Mr. Dickson was a merchant tailor of some means. Notice the careful detailing and fine woodwork. The Dixon Stevenson House has been furnished to reflect tastes of the first half of the 19th century. Dixon Stevenson house will give you a good idea of how many Newbern homes looked in the early 1800s.
The grand opening of Tryon Palace was a moment long awaited. Colonial North Carolina was celebrating its new Capitol building. This event was heralded from as far away as Richmond, Virginia. Who would have guessed that in only 28 years, most of the palace would burn to the ground? And in 1945, the site of Tryon Palace would be buried under George Street. And that in 1959, the palace would be rebuilt and restored to its original splendor and open to the public. Let's go back to the palace's beginnings. It was special because it was the first permanent meeting place for the Colonial Council of North Carolina. It was also home to the Tryon family and an elegant stopping place for important guests from the colonies and from England. Visitors could be entertained and fed in style. In the kitchen, a dish like eel pie with oysters might have been cooked and served with many courses in the palace dining room. The colonies at this time belonged to the England of His Majesty George III. Because Governor Tryon was an Englishman, he had John Hawks design the palace in the style of fine English country homes. We call this style of architecture Georgian. Georgian houses are massive. The walls of Tryon Palace are 3 feet thick. Georgian ornamentation shows a love of the ancient styles of Greece and Rome and a fascination with the Orient. Georgian houses look formal because one side is a mirror image of the other side. This is called symmetry. In Tryon Palace, you can see symmetry outside and inside. For all its elegance and fine craftsmanship, the palace was an object of controversy. From start to completion, the cost of the palace tripled. Much of the money was raised by taxing the colonists. To many hard-pressed settlers to the west of Newbern, who would never even see the palace, it seemed a ridiculous luxury. The settlers, enraged by many high taxes, took up arms. Tryon rallied a citizen army that marched all the way to Alamance Creek to put down the uprising. But in spite of opposition, Governor Tryon gained the support of many people. Tryon supported religious freedom for the Moravians, Presbyterians, Quakers, Lutherans, and others. He expanded the postal road system and was a strong supporter of education. The palace functioned as a seat of royal government for only 6 years. After independence, it became the first Capitol building of the state of North Carolina. In 1794, the government abandoned the palace when the Capitol moved to Raleigh. When it burned in 1798, it had seen over 20 years of abuse and neglect. In the 1920s and 1930s, there was a renewed interest in the palace. The Tryon Palace Commission was formed in 1945. 7 years of archaeological work, combined with research and documentation, laid the groundwork for an authentic restoration. Today you can experience the palace as it was in its heyday. You'll see demonstrations of how things were made by palace servants. You can walk in 18th century gardens, through a formal garden, take a turn and be in a wilderness garden. Like the gardens, the interiors of the palace change with the seasons, and every season is celebrated with special events.
are two shops. One, the museum shop in the historic Dave's house. The other, the craft and garden shop, just behind the kitchen wing of the palace. You can buy replicas of some of the things you'll see today, such as ironwork, forged by the palace blacksmith, or a basket, made by a palace worker using 18th century techniques. Buy a kit and make this needlework pillow. The pattern is from this chair in the Stevenson house. You may want to buy a book about colonial life, or buy flowers grown in the Tryon Palace gardens. The museum shop and the reception center have free tour maps and brochures that tell you about the sights and special events in New Bern. As you tour the streets of New Bern, look for this symbol. It marks historic places. You can help preserve New Bern's history by following these simple rules. Please stay on the visitor's side and do not enter roped-off areas. Please don't smoke while inside the historic buildings, and don't eat food or chew gum while inside the historic buildings. Please do not touch objects that are on exhibit. Do not take photographs during guided tours. With your cooperation, the beauty of this place will be preserved.
Let's go back to another time, to the days when Governor Tryon read in his library, back to a morning when the Stanley children played in this yard, to an afternoon when tea was served in the parlor of the Stevenson house, to the days of weavers and candle makers, horses and carriages, through the gates to another time in New Bern.